All right, my friend. We are going to conclude Ulysses today, talk a little bit about chapters 16, 17, 18, a little bit about how this work is a work of modernism, as well as a work of metempsychosis, as Molly Bloom would say for us, as well as whether this is a masterpiece or not. But prior to jumping into Ulysses, I opened my Times Literary Supplement, the TLS, London-based literary journal that posts reviews on recent books. And it says to me, and this is how I know that our books are still alive, because I often see writing about James Joyce, or even in this own November 1st issue, I see Virginia Woolf, but I also see here, not to be overlooked, Helmut Schwarzer writes from Newbury, New Hampshire, is the centenary, the 100-year anniversary this month of the publication of Der Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain. TLS readers, and also my students, will be able to read more about Thomas Mann's greatest novel in the paper later this month. TLS readers of a century ago, so this publication was quite stately and old, of a century ago, would have been made aware of Mann's achievement when a review by A.W.G. Randall appeared in the issue of March 12, 1925, a review of the German original. The novel known to the Anglophone world, the English-speaking world, as The Magic Mountain only appeared in translation 2 years later. And all these 1,200 pages, Randall warned, our version's about 750 pages. There is scarcely a defined plot. Instead, it was the symbolically representative residence. It was the symbolically representative residence of pre-war Davos. That's where a huge economic conference happens every year in Greece. Hans Kotzdorff, Claudia Schoscha, et alia, that means and others, et al, if you ever see that, who constituted Mann's greatest achievement. While it seemed unlikely that Der Zauberberg would be a very popular novel, at least outside Germany, the reviewer argued anyone interested in Central European life and thought should read it. So Der Zauberberg is experiencing its centenary this month of this year, almost like I planned it that way, though I really can't claim that I did. I stumbled upon this. So walk in literary woods, find literary things. Okay, so let's conclude Ulysses now. We've made it to chapter 16. Chapter 16 starts the final 3 chapters of Ulysses and the final part of Ulysses. Recall that the first part was the first 3 chapters featuring Stephen, called the Telemachia. The next part were the journeys of Odysseus, chapters 4 through 15 of Bloom, and also alternating with Stephen Daedalus as well. And now these last 3 chapters are called the nostos, or homecoming. Remember, nostos, like nostalgia, is the pain of home, pain of longing for home. When Odysseus makes it home to Ithaca, he does so on a magical ship from the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians are the people that occupied the land of Scheria, where he met Nausicaa, who is symbolically represented by Gertie McDowell in the Nausicaa episode. And Odysseus comes home in hiding. What do I mean? He comes home to a secret port that humans do not use, but rather the immortals use. And Athena sprays a mist over Ithaca so that he does not recognize it. But not only does he not recognize Ithaca, but Athena, after she interacts with Odysseus, will then change how he looks, change him into disguise. She will take away his curly locks and his enlarged muscles and his better looks. She will turn him into an old and enfeebled beggar. So when he returns home not in majesty, like Agamemnon, who was the war chief of the Achaeans, who when he showed up back home and walked along a purple rug, as it were, as the dramatists tell us, his wife Clytemnestra had been plotting against him while he had been gone. Sort of like how a cancer creeps up on you over years. It's not today, it's not tomorrow, but it's building the forces against you. Clytemnestra put Agamemnon to the sword, the ostensibly most deserving, highest ranking person in the world at the time, certainly in the world that they knew. Odysseus, himself now coming home after an elongated absence, is counseled by wisdom, and in fact the goddess of wisdom, Athena, to not approach his home with arrogance, to come home humbly and in disguise in order to test the people in his home. Because the people there now are not the same people as when he left. This is literally true. Of course, people have died over the last 20 years and been replaced, but this is also figuratively true. The people that were loyal to Odysseus when he was there, are they still loyal to him? What do I mean? There are 108 suitors now there. These are the elite young men of the Ithacan holdings, the Ithacan kingdom at this time is Ithaca, as well as the Zakynthos, as well as Same and Dulichion, I think. There are like 4 different islands, and they sail every day from their homes to court Penelope. What does it mean to court Penelope? Well, they eat her food, they drink her wine, they insult her son, they plot against her son's life at one point. When he returns from seeing Nestor and Menelaus, they actually have an ambush ready for him that Athena keeps him from passing by. So these suitors who ostensibly want to marry Penelope are more like usurpers, more like the word that was used at the very end of the first chapter of Ulysses that perhaps we see Buck Mulligan as, perhaps we even see Blazes Boylan as. And so when Odysseus returns home, it is in ignominy, not with all the great fame that even magical singers and islands he has never been to, like Scoria, sing. So when he's traveling about, he literally encounters singers who are already singing his tales. So out in the world, Odysseus is famous, insanely famous. But when he comes home, he doesn't benefit at all from any of that fame. So keep that in mind as the frame for Bloom returning to his home where his wife has just cheated on him. And remember the things that he's going to find. It's not in any way not obvious that she's cheated on him. When he comes home, he bangs his head on something because his furniture has been moved around, obviously moved around so that somebody can be entertained. There are cigarettes, additional cigarettes in, remember when people smoke cigarettes, in ashtrays. There used to be ashtrays everywhere. If you go to Europe or South America, you see ashtrays everywhere. You forget that they're not around here. But right, these are clear indications. These are the sorts of things that if you had a boyfriend or girlfriend over during high school at your home and you were engaging in that sort of thing, perhaps you were 18 at the time, you would make sure to hide these things. You would be like, this is not, this is something obvious, easy to see. They leave their cigarettes, they leave the furniture where it is, and like I've told you before, there's even still an indentation in the bed as well as crumbs from where Boylan was, as well as marks of his attempt to inseminate Molly as well. And so Bloom is not coming home to a situation in which he is being treated like a king. This is very much the opposite. I mean, I can't really imagine, especially as not just as a literary, lecturer, but as a husband, the emotions that he would feel in having such a brazen act committed against him. Odysseus himself, over and over and over again, after he returns to Ithaca, endures things that we might think are unendurable. He endures insults from his own servants, at this time, slaves. Slavery was a little bit different in ancient Greece, also then again in ancient Rome from, say, 19th, 18th century America, but still, slavery. He was known to be a good master, a good lord, which we know because of the individual who gives his name to this chapter, Eumaeus, I would say. But Eumaeus is himself a swineherd who is a slave, and this shows something about the sort of maybe unjustness of the institution of slavery as it is, but should give some context. Aristotle, 4th century philosopher, talks about slavery. Slavery is obviously a major part of the ancient world, and he asks whether there is a such thing as a natural slave. And he goes back and forth on this and suggests that if there were going to be such a thing, it would have to be something that was deprived of its reason. So a human that was incapable of thinking. But it says, a problem is that if somebody is born with elite status in one society, and then they're conquered by another society and then enslaved, and then they have children, wouldn't that child, had it been born in the original society, be an elite, be free? Well, what does it mean that it's now a slave? It was born in slavery, but is it naturally a slave? And that is a very interesting example when one thinks about Eumaeus, who was himself born into a noble home, but but was stolen by his caretaker, taken onto a ship with pirates. This was so he could be sold back to his family for a ransom. But the woman who sold him died, and then he's eventually sold to Odysseus's father. And so Eumaeus is himself somebody with noble blood, but finds himself enslaved. But he shows himself to be noble through his character, his choices, and his actions. So he's like a humanist, I guess you might say. And he, unlike Melanthios, a goat herd, who was a slave of Odysseus, who literally kicks Odysseus while he's on his way to the city in which his home exists. Ithaca is an island with a city on it. It's not very big. We think we found the actual island, and there is an island called Ithaca now, but whether it's the actual one that Odysseus lived in, this is an old story. We don't know. But so we find that even the servants at Odysseus's home are divided in their loyalties and in their actions. And so we make our way to Eumaeus and Ulysses and the Cabman's shelter, and cacophony that had joined us so earlier seems to have ended it. So we're reminded of the time I mentioned the Phaedo by Plato, and Socrates had his shackles, his manacles taken off his hands, and he thought about the great relief that he felt when he got to rub his wrists. And I now myself feel relief that our sonorous times have come again. In any case, this is the beginning of chapter 16, Eumaeus. Preparatory to anything else, Mr. Bloom brushed off the greater bulk of the shavings and handed Stephen the hat and ash plant and bucked him up generally in Orthodox Samaritan fashion, which he very badly needed. It's very interesting. Something about hats and Bloom. John Henry Menton, who he had beaten in some gambling game earlier in the Hades chapter, he tells him that he has a divot in his hat. John Henry Menton sort of coldly takes off his hat, punches it out, puts it back on stiffly. Thank you, sir. Supposedly, Charles Stewart Parnell, who I've talked about very little during the course of these lectures, who was a late 19th century Irish advocate for home rule. Supposedly, when he returned home after being ruined, and I'll just say one thing about this, his hat fell off, and Bloom picked it up and handed it to him. And he said with perfect aplomb, that means perfectly civil, very social, said, "Thank you, sir," but not coldly. He, in the wake of being politically ruined because of his affair with a married woman called Kitty O'Shea, still had the sociality, the civic, how should I even put this? The stiff upper lip to be social and to give Bloom his due, to say thank you when something small was done for him, even in the wake of being totally ruined, not only personally, but Charles Stewart Parnell's entire party turned against him when the church also turned against him because he was now an infidel, or now he was now not an infidel. That's a slight means something. It means apostate, but he had now shown himself to be a cheater, an adulterer, as it were. And so the church turned against him. He lost his political influence, and with his loss of political influence, the end of the 19th century ended with Ireland's last strongest attempt at their own independence. And so, sort of a recurring theme one sees throughout literature, and this is definitely something, if somebody wants to think in a feminist way, is very present, and it is the place that sort of women have in the ruining of famous men. And so what do I mean? I mean Helen of Troy and Menelaus, the great king. She leaves him with Paris. A great war occurs. Who else do I mean? Well, Adam and Eve. Eve eats of this apple on this tree, and then is blamed by Adam for this happening. He says, "Oh, look, the woman did it," and then God dispels them both. And you see this also with Charles Stewart Parnell, the idea that and also, of course, Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, the idea that the relationship between a man and a woman is a very special one, but that the thing that can ruin a person worse, particularly the worst thing that can ruin a person's life and also reputation and cause massive conflict up to large-scale war is the breaking of the bond between a man and a woman. And so one sees that not only represented in mythologically in multiple traditions, Greco-Roman tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, one sees that also playing out in 19th century Ireland. One also sees this playing out in 20th century Ulysses, this piece of literature. And so as we get closer to the marital bed at the very, in which this text concludes, we are getting to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter, in not only this book, but in the country in which this book exists, and in the tradition in which this book and country have evolved from, these dual traditions of Athens and Jerusalem that have come together. In any case, so part 3 is called the nostos. It begins here. Eumaeus, or Eumaeus, as we now usually call him, is a swineherd who was active as a substitute father for Telemachus. It's very nice, yes, it is true. While Odysseus has been gone, he helps Odysseus defeat the suitors and wins this freedom for it. Oh, something very interesting is that when Odysseus is in disguise and is at the shelter of Eumaeus, talking to him, lying to him about who he is and where he comes from, says he's a Cretan. He's not yet going to give up his identity to this person who he doesn't yet trust. Telemachus comes back, his son. First time he's seen him in 20 years. To hold himself in. This is part of one of the unendurable things. Could you hold back from embracing your son? What about your wife or your husband? What about your father or your mother? What about your dog who's just about to die? Would you chastise people who you considered beneath yourself, who then tried to enter into combat with people that you could? Well, Odysseus does get into a fight with the beggar and lays him out. So very unlike Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul. More like Mike Tyson when he was a lot younger. Though there's some evidence, some people are suggesting that fight was in fact staged. In any case, when Telemachus comes home, or not yet home, but gets to the shelter of Eumaeus, and he addresses Eumaeus, he addresses him, I believe, 3 times as father, 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 right in front of the person who is actually his father, who is not allowed to show an emotional reaction. It's neither joy at seeing his son, nor even sadness at being sort of unconsciously slighted by his son, by seeing his own position usurped by his own servant and slave who is loyal to him. But something that you note from what I just read in bullet point is that Eumaeus, in helping Odysseus to combat the suitors, there are huge odds against them, by the way. There's only Phoeicius, an ox herd, Eumaeus, a swineherd, these low-level positions. Telemachus and Odysseus 4, plus a huge trump card, which is Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who the goddess Nike, which is the goddess of victory, sits in her hand and accompanies her. They also fight with her, but against 108 men. And so the odds are huge against them. That said, Eumaeus and Phoeicius are given land and freedom as a result of their actions with Odysseus. What is the equivalent to Eumaeus' shelter in Ulysses? It is a cabman's shelter. A cabman shelter that is open pretty late. It's the sort of place that you go, not 12 a.m., 1 a.m. This is the sort of place you go to get grub and drink after drinking. This is that nasty place with really nasty food and really nasty non-alcoholic drinks. They've got very hard buns to eat, as well as undrinkable coffee, which that really resonates with me as a coffee drinker who really likes, at least decent coffee. But there's a certain level I want. I'll still drink Starbucks and things, but if I see an espresso maker that looks way too old, doesn't have an Italian name, no thank you. I'd rather just have something else. In any case, this is a cabman shelter, the sort of place that people go late night, after they've had their nights. And like I said, the guy who runs the cabman shelter is called Skin the Goat. There in the cabman shelter, we finally have a chance to see Stephen and Will talk to each other. They start to talk. And we see also a figure of Odysseus there. There is literally a sailor telling stories, tall tales in this shelter, who has a tattoo of a Greek sailor on his chest. Some of the stories he tells, that he's been away for 7 years, that he's returning to the south of Ireland to his bonny lass who has been waiting for him. He even tells a story about a man being eaten alive by a shark. These are the sorts of stories that you hear at 1 a.m. in somewhere like a Cabman shelter, and you think, well, these are definitely true, or you think, I don't know, these are sort of tall tales. So a question one has during the course of this particular chapter is, who is Odysseus? Is it Leopold Bloom, who has always had desires to travel, but himself has not traveled very far? Odysseus himself, a world traveler, had traveled the range of the known world at the time in which he existed. But Bloom, he's traveled around Dublin quite a bit, and he's gone out to some islands near. He has been on a ship before. Of course, 1904, he had never been on a plane. But so who is the true Odysseus? Is it the Bloom who's going about effectively making change in his community while being treated like an outsider and not being seen for the value that he truly has? Or is it this more obvious figure of Odysseus who has been away from his home for several years, who has a tattoo of sailor on his chest, was seeing magical, unbelievable things and tells stories about it to unsuspecting people listening? Who truly is Odysseus? The liar who tells tall tales and accomplishes nothing? Or the person that though you cannot even see it nor would expect it from this person, does unimaginable things? This is like the sort of question of like, if I were to bring out like a 6'5" sort of Adonis looking person out here, and then bring out some tiny little human and be like, which one looks like the leader? And one of them is, say, like The Rock. If he had really long hair, like the Scorpion King usually doesn't have much hair. But then one is, as it turns out, Napoleon. Napoleon wasn't actually super short for his time, but something we talk about. But the idea is that the person that looks like the obvious leader, The Rock, is not necessarily the person capable of achieving the greatest results as a leader like Napoleon. And perhaps one dislikes what he accomplished during the course of the French Revolution, but he achieved a tremendous amount. And so the obvious looking or superficial look, the person who looks like a leader by superficial considerations is not necessarily the person who has the most substantial reasons for being. In any case, let's talk about a little bit of what Bloom and Stephen discuss. So remember also that Bloom has just, so the whole reason I went on the tangent about the hats and Bloom giving a hat to Stephen is that he's been knocked down by one of these soldiers that had punched him in the face, and then cops showed up and Corny Kelleher, the police informant, had to shoo them off by saying, oh, these are just boys being boys. Don't worry about it, nothing to trouble yourselves with. And so the cops go on. So Bloom picks up this man who's just been punched in the face. It's the worse for wear for drink, and is kind of taking him over. He's described as his fetus Achilles. This is another learned reference to the Aeneid. Fetus Achilles, faithful Achilles, is the friend of Aeneas, who is the leader of the fallen Trojans who will become the proto-Romans by the end of the Aeneid. He is the person that is always by his side. So he's described, this is like what you would say, if you wanted to say something really beautiful about, like, say, your 19-year-old friend who died, you might call them your fetus Achilles. And that would make everybody cry. It'd be terribly it'd be full of pathos. In any case, Bloom mentions that Stephen's friends abandoned him, perhaps trying to give him some insight into the character of the people around him. His last friend that was around him scampered off when he almost got into a scuffle with the soldiers, talking about my bleeding effing king, as the soldier says. I'll beat anybody to a pulp who says something about my bleeding. He didn't say effing, he says the word itself, king. Stephen really riles this guy up. Not the time to parse out nuanced distinctions with somebody around 1 a.m. at night after drinking, perhaps. Though perhaps not, depending on exactly the situation. In any case, Bloom mentions that Stephen's friends abandoned him, and that one was Judas, says Stephen, suggesting that the last one that abandoned him was an even greater betrayer. Obviously, Judas is the greatest betrayer in the New Testament. He is the apostle of Jesus, who for 30 silver pieces sold out Jesus to the Pharisees, and is in some ways indirectly responsible for the death of Jesus. And so this is taken very seriously by Catholics, in particular one named Dante, put Judas in the ninth circle, the lowest circle of hell, in the front mouth of three-headed Satan, where he is being torn apart by teeth, head first. Catius and Brutus, political conspirators against Julius Caesar, are on the right and left heads, but the front head is reserved for Judas. And not only is he being eaten head first constantly, literally like he is a thought that cannot be digested, something that is simply chewed on ad infinitum, like an old piece of gum. But he's also having his back ripped by the claws of Satan. So you can imagine, in the sort of Catholic Western imaginary, Judas is the worst of the worst. Call someone a Judas, friendship is over. In fact, the final subsection of hell is called Judeca, after Judas himself. So Stephen is at least clear-eyed enough to know the value of his friends. Bloom shows Stephen a picture of Molly. This is sort of an interesting thing to do with somebody that you've just met. It seems to suggest that he thinks that Molly is pretty, and that this will have an effect on Stephen, because he wants to invite Stephen to live with him. He comes up with this idea that if Stephen were to live with me, he has this beautiful voice and knows some Italian. He could teach Molly Italian, and then she could sing even more operas, and that would be wonderful. He starts to come up with this idea. This will not work out. Stephen will not accept the full hospitality of Bloom, though he will go home with him. He will eat chocolate milk or drink chocolate milk with him, sort of an inverted version of his meal with Buck Mulligan earlier. He will not stay the night, will not accept the opportunity to stay with Bloom. There are some commentators, James Heffernan in particular, suggest that this suggests that Bloom and Stephen do not have a father-son relationship. I think that's not quite right. Stephen is not a dependent anymore. He's not 15, he is not 16, he's 22, he has a job. I think Bloom does represent a father to Stephen, but the thing that the father has to learn to do with his children, and particularly at this time with his son, is to let him go out into the world. All the other adult, mature men either ignore Stephen, if they're his actual father, or they try to make him into something just like themselves. You should be a newspaperman. You should be a teacher. You should be a Jesuit. Bloom is the one that has to let him go. In the same way that Odysseus, when he returns to his home in Ithaca, is going to have to recognize that Telemachus is not a son that he is going to get to raise. Telemachus is going to have to go make his own fortune. And actually, how it turns out in the Odyssey is that Odysseus himself, but according to prophecy, doesn't get to stay in Ithaca very long. He settles his accounts and he moves on to the next place. He's very much a figure of the wanderer. In any case, they discuss music. Bloom likes Mercadante, something just interesting. Recall that Bloom, when he was yelling at the citizen, talked about famous Jewish figures, Karl Marx, Baruch Spinoza, Jesus. He mentions Mercadante too. That's a very interesting moment. Mercadante was not Jewish. He's Italian, 18th, 19th century composer. But I think that shows when you argue with somebody and really are trying to spit something out fast at them, you often make mistakes. And Bloom does too. But he likes Mercadante and Mozart. He thinks Wagner is a bit much for him. If you ever listen to Ride of the Valkyries, you see that Wagner is full of passion and power, and really can be a bit much. Not the sort of music you would study to, for example. I mean, maybe if you're really writing and you want to be bleeding onto the keyboard, but Mozart can be a little tamer. Not always, but because he has great range. But Wagner is almost always at all the way up, as we would say. In any case, he likes the German folk song, The Voices of Sirens, Sweet Murderers of Men. And Bloom doesn't care for the title of this song that Stephen likes. And then I mentioned the figure of W.B. Murphy, the sailor with red hair and a tattoo of a Greek sailor on his chest, who's been away from his Bonnie Lass for 7 years. And Bloom himself considers himself an adventurous person, though he has not traveled widely. What a note. This is why it's nice to have some notes. As the two leave the Cabman shelter for Eccles Street, where Bloom's home is, and take a carriage towards Bloom's home, like many of the chapters in this text, it ends with a really interesting, if perhaps vulgar and very modernist image and sound. But a horse stops. And imagine this is time prior to cars, so they're horse-drawn carriage. There are horses everywhere. A horse stops and drops 3 smoking globes of turds. So yet another modernist thing that we have been shown to. We've seen onanism, we've seen defecation, we've seen drunkenness, we've seen, we will see urination in chapter 17, and now we see animal defecation. And yet the idea seems to be that this is all part of city living, and that this is part of modern life. These sounds and these events and the ways in which we do them. I mean, something that you might think about is like the Turkish bath and the outhouse that Bloom is in. Are those experiences that you yourself have? Or when you do similar activities, do you do them in very different ways? For example, do you use an outhouse? Probably not. Probably not. And do you ever see horses dropping smoking globes? I have a lot of times, probably because I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans and various places that still have horses. But most of the time, if one lived in sort of a modern city, you see cars. You see much more exhaust than you see horse feet, which is perhaps nice. In any case, chapter 17, Ithaca, Bloom and Stephen make it back to their house. I'm not going to say a ton about this, except for to say that this is a chapter in which presence is replaced by absence. What do I mean? The first half of the chapter is a major intellectual conversation between Bloom and Stephen, which is made all the sadder. And the test of the sadness of this, that in the fact that something that is iterated to us is that Bloom used to have many nocturnal perambulations, not the same as somnambulism. Somnambulism, and you know what that is? Somnos, dream, ambulos, or ambulare, to walk, dream walking, sleepwalking. Nocturnal perambulations are evening conversations, nighttime conversations. And when he was younger, he had long, major conversations with people all the time. I hope that you in your life now look so tired in front of me at this late morning hour that it's that for you is an early morning hour, perhaps, because the vast majority of your real living happens at night, because you're still having great conversations, because something that happened to Bloom and something I'd say even happens to me, even as a literary professor, someone that lives in ideas. The deep conversations about life start to fade as one takes one's responsibilities. You are more than welcome to fight against that truth as much as you can. But unless you're just really recycling through friends who are in different stages of life, there will be a certain development in your own life as well. Well, in any case, what I mean to say is that this is special for Bloom. He doesn't have these sorts of conversations. He doesn't have this sort of day that often. He's not up at this hour most of the time, 2 a.m. He's a professional man. And not, a career drunk like Patty Dignam or Simon Dedalus. And so the first half of the chapter, we get a description of the conversation between Stephen and Bloom. I want you to really think about that. We get a description. It's in fact supposedly or described sometimes as catechistic format. If you're Catholic, you may know about the question and answer format of the catechism that often you read in lieu of the Bible prior to confirmation. A joke about Catholics, and you can think this is funny or not, depending on your experience, Catholicism is that they do not read this. It's just kind of a funny joke, depending on how much one knows about the subject. Or kind of not a funny joke, if one knows even more, I guess. But that said, we finally get the opportunity to see these two protagonists interact with each other, and we are denied it. We don't actually hear what they have to say in the narration through our eyes, but hear about what it is that they say to each other. It is a major denial. And it also is the mark that we have lost access to Bloom and Stephen's voices. We will not hear their voices in the first person. We've lost, for the remainder of the text, we've lost insight into their own streams of consciousness, though we have been perhaps inundated by them through the first 16 chapters. We are now denied them for the last 2. So what is it that these two, well, I guess let me say a couple. Bloom had to perform a so-called aeronautical maneuver to get in, because remember, he forgot his key at the beginning of the day. This Stephen Dedalus also doesn't have a key to his own home. These 2 men without keys, as it were. So they must storm the house in which a suitor has laid siege to Odysseus, to Bloom's wife. That's very interesting. Yes, they have to break in, as it were. Though Stephen and Bloom are together, we do not have direct access to the narrative. Rather, a narrator in catechistic format narrates their conversation to us. This creates a painful narrative distance between our 2 main characters and us right at the moment we have been longing to see since the beginning of the book. Stephen will leave at the end. Like Telemachus, he must seek his own fortune. Though it is Odysseus who leaves, Ithaca again after defeating the suitors. See how much this comes from. Interesting. Bloom makes Stephen some cocoa. A little bit different from going to the Cabman's shelter. Cocoa, something that can be drunk. And even more especially, he puts special cream into the cocoa. Something you may know if you are a chocolate milk or hot chocolate drinker is that making hot chocolate with water makes it thin, terrible. Making it with milk, it's thick, tastes good. He actually puts cream in it. Cream is even thicker than milk. Cream tastes fantastic. If you're lactose intolerant, you will find out very quickly if you drink heavy cream. Sometimes called creamer, inelegant by people. And he takes Molly's special cream, and he gives it to Stephen. This seems so small, perhaps so small that you think it's unworthy of notice. I think it's the opposite. It's like the cufflinks. Subtle, not small. It's when somebody offers you something that is important to them, that they have to give a finite quantity of to you, they're offering you something real. They're offering something that he could have saved for himself. This is very different from somebody that, say, like the suitors, who offer something that is not theirs. When they sit to dinner at table, they're eating another man's food while they try to steal another man's wife. The things that they offer are not theirs to offer in the first place. So Bloom is showing true hospitality. It's humble, of course. But Bloom, what is he? Is he a prince? His name may mean the people's prince, but he is sort of a normal middle-class man. And so to offer a little hospitality while also getting Stephen out of a terrible scrape, both in Nighttown with Bella Cohen and her trying to overcharge him, and then with the police, now bringing him to his own home and then feeding him from his own food. This is not a small thing that Bloom is doing. Nobody else is doing this for Stephen, even his own friends. Bloom is sort of a stranger. This tells you something about his character. So what do they talk about? They talk about their ages. Bloom is 38. Stephen is 22. Bloom used to have another job as a cattle sales person. Let me come over here. This is a little bit larger. Bloom's books are mentioned. He has some books, not books he's written. A book including Spinoza's writing, there's Baruch Spinoza again, and Strength and How to Obtain It. That's by Eugene Sandow, one of the first strongmen from the late 19th, early 20th century. I actually have owned that book before, very good. It tells about how he traveled around America and put on shows and things like that. And he talks about using this thing called a dumbbell to do curls. It's really funny, particularly with how far we've come with sports science these days. Once drew up a plan for Irish independence, showing that he is by no means a Zionist, but very much an Irish national individual. He thinks Maimonides, Spinoza, and Moses Mendelssohn are preeminent intellects. Moses Maimonides and Spinoza are 2 of the greatest philosophers ever to existed, but they're generally considered the 2 greatest Jewish philosophers. Moses Maimonides from the 12th century, 12th century Andalusia, and Baruch Spinoza himself from Amsterdam in the 17th century. Stephen writes Irish, and this is a very sweet one too. Stephen starts to write letters of ancient Irish, and Bloom doesn't know ancient Irish, but he knows a little bit of Hebrew. So he writes out some Hebrew letters for him. They're showing what each other know. They're showing the difference between themselves and others. They consider whether aliens on another planet would be saved by God. A very interesting theoretical question if one is a believer and very interested in those sorts of things. They micturate together. That means they urinate next to each other. And then Stephen leaves. And that's it. And that's it. And then, then Bloom is left with his own thoughts. So after Stephen leaves, Bloom thinks of studying folk tales, comparative religion, or astronomy to keep up his intellect. Stephen Man's pretty smart. Sort of fires him up to use his own mind again. Thinks of his father's suicide note to him and his father's dog, Athos. Considers whether to leave Molly or to join her in bed. It's a big thing to think about at 2 a.m. in the morning. Finds the imprint of a man there and crumbs of potted meat. Question that he asked himself, divorce? He didn't say no. He says, not now. I'll tell you, I'm such an evil husband, but that's what I always say to my wife. And you know, there's an element of just realism in there. Is that I could say I'll never, and this would never, but life is a day-to-day affair. So what will never or what will always happen is yet to be determined. So the more honest one is with oneself, the more honest one can be with others. But Bloom is being honest with himself. Not now does not mean never. He kisses Molly's rump. Is exactly what it sounds like. She's sleeping. He goes in there. It's a very affectionate thing for him to do, apparently, and has it confirmed that it has been, in fact, 10 years, 5 months, 18 days since carnal intercourse had been complete. And then he thinks of Sinbad as he falls asleep. Enter Molly. Molly noticed Bloom enter into the room, and she finally gets to have her voice. The 18th chapter of an 18-chapter book in which her name has been featured over and over and over again. In fact, her name has been, to some extent, debated. Is she Mrs. Marion Bloom? Is she Molly Bloom? A woman whose our opinion of her has largely been determined by the opinions of the men in the city. So now when she gets to speak for herself, will we judge her by what she says or by that which we already know about her from the minds of others? Perhaps this is the great difficulty of getting to know anybody that you already know something about without having had personal experience of the individual. But I have to go back. So I'm going to read very quickly 2 of her great quotes from the very beginning and from the very end. Notice the lack of punctuation. Yes, because he never did a thing like that before to ask to get his breakfast in bed and a couple of eggs since the City Arms Hotel when he used to be pretending to be laid up with a sick voice doing his highness to make himself interesting for all that old, we'll say F word, Mrs. Riordan, that he thought he had a great leg of, and she never left us a farthing all for masses for herself, and her sole greatest miser ever was actually afraid to lay out $4 for a methylated spirit, telling me all her ailments, that she had too much old chat in her about politics and earthquakes and the end of the world to let us have a bit of fun first. God help the world if all women were her sort, down on the bathing suits and low necks, of course. This sounds very modern, right? Nobody wanted her to warm them. I suppose she was pious because no man would look at her twice. I hope I'll never be like her. A wonder she didn't want us to cover our faces, but she was. Just thinking about the fact that this prudish old woman used to tell them to cover up. Like, you can't wear that around here. But she's also thinking about the fact that Bloom has never asked for breakfast in bed, and yet he seems to have done it, and she seems inclined to do so. That's very strange given the fact that she's just cheated on Bloom. He's now asking for more from her. He's asking to invert the wifely and husband role back, right? The traditional role of breakfast in bed in the early 20th century Ireland, the idea is that Molly would have done that for Bloom, but Bloom inverts this. He does that for Molly, but now he asks for reciprocity. Perhaps that is the true difference. In any case, yes is how this chapter begins. Yes is also how it ends with a period. Yes, right. Just a couple facts. Molly Bloom speaks 2 grammatical periods in the text, and also a menstrual cycle begins during the course of it. This is a very vulgar bed, right? It's full of potted crumbs. There's seminal fluid on it. There's smells and indentations from one man, not the man there. And there's also now blood on the bed. And so this is life right here. This is a very modernist location. In any case, she speaks of coitus with Boylan, the determined, vicious look on his face, and the size of him. Apparently, he slapped her butt too, and she thought that was vulgar. When she compares Boylan to Bloom. She finds Boylan lacking. Bloom is sensitive, treats her with respect, is different from the people around him. Boylan is boisterous. Boylan is just like all of the Irish people in Dublin to her, though he's a little bit wealthier and more handsome. In any case, Molly suspects that Bloom is cheating. He's come home at 2 a.m. What in God's name has he been doing? He himself sprinkles a little bit of fibbing into the truth. When he talks to her, we hear what he has said. We don't see it. But he says, oh, no, I was invited to dinner and then I went to see a show. None of these things are true. But when we now judge Molly, the fact that she cheated on Bloom, keep in mind that she thinks that Bloom is cheating and in fact is aware of the fact that he is engaging in his written correspondence with Martha Clifford. So she's a lot more with it than we were led to believe. In any case, I'll end everything. Now, I have to end it because the class is over, but I'll say things as you leave. I guess to say, yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breast, all perfumed, yes, and his heart was going like mad, yes. I said, yes, I will, yes. So was Ulysses. We have a couple lectures on the Magic Mountain coming up soon.